Hello and welcome to Lexitecture, a podcast about word origins and histories. My name is Ryan, and in each episode my friend Amy and I bring a new pair of words to share their stories with each other and you. You can find our past episodes and the occasional blog post on our website at lexitecture.com. Follow along with us on Twitter and Facebook at Lexitecture, and if you really like what we do, you can support the show at patreon.com/lexitecture. Today's episode, Read English.
We better talk about some words before this all gets even more depressing than it already is.
We should probably talk about some words. Speaking of non-depressing news, though, new Patreon sponsor.
Oh, yay!
So I sent a message. My normal kind of procedure is to ask how to pronounce the people's names and what names they would like to use.
Sure.
So my default is just to go with the first name, and I hope I get the pronunciation right. So this person's name is either Leah or Leia, and I know that this is one of those names where people get probably rightfully annoyed at people mispronouncing their name if you are one or the other, because there are two very common, I think, pronunciations of it. How would you pronounce Leah?
Leah. I would probably say Leah.
Yeah.
However, I know someone whose name is spelled thusly and whose name is pronounced Lee.
Oh, maybe it's... Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Well,
so sorry to throw that into the mix.
Well, you've really made things difficult. But whoever you are, thank you. How about that?
Just doing my job. Yeah, thank you, Leah, Lee, and any other pronunciations that may or may not apply to you. Awesome. Thank you so much for supporting us.
And, yeah. So, we can now safely word.
Let us word.
Let us word. Okay. I don't know.
Do you want me to, before we do that,
Okay.
sorry, I had a vague, I should talk to Ryan about this kind of sense. I have become really irritated by part of the lexicon of coronavirus.
Okay.
And I don't know if I'm just being incredibly grumpy, because that is sort of how I am feeling at the moment about everything.
Right.
But are people in Canada talking about self-isolating?
So, yes. And I assume it's the redundancy of that sentence, that phrase that is rankling you?
Yeah. And I don't know when this started. I don't know when it happened, because it was a thing that everyone was talking about, you know, when we started to kind of go back to places and track and trace and testing and all this stuff was going on. Oh, well, you'll have to self-isolate for 14 days. You'll have to self-isolate, da-da-da-da-da. And slowly, eventually, sort of drip-wise, I started to think, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, it makes sense. I get what you're talking about, but, like, is the distinction being drawn here, like, self-isolating, as in you're choosing to isolate, rather than us forcing you to be isolated?
For me, that's what I take away from it. That's sort of the sense that I get from it, that the it's self-imposed isolation.
But it isn't self-imposed isolation.
No.
Because someone else is telling you have to do it.
It's sort of self-enforced isolation.
So, yeah, I don't know. I was just... And then it was like once somebody says, oh, God, that noise is really annoying. You know, now I feel properly aggrieved by the existence of this phrase. And I don't know why. It really shouldn't be such a big deal. But every time I hear someone talking about self-isolation, I get annoyed.
It's like, see, this is this thing again. I got to the point, I think I've got to the point now where I don't actually need a little sticky note on the wall that says, it's feudalism, stupid, because I think I've got that in my head now. What I need now is a thing that reminds me whether it's Baader-Meinhof or Dunning-Kruger that I'm thinking of. I think it's Baader-Meinhof. But it's like a very specific Baader-Meinhof thing where it's, instead of noticing it all the time, it's just, you always kind of noticed it.
Annoying.
But now that you've known about it, it's specifically the irritating side of it is sort of the Baader-Meinhof thing. If I've got that right at all.
You are correct,
Okay.
yeah. Baader-Meinhof is where you see something or read something and then you see it everywhere.
Yes, okay.
And
Good.
Dunning-Kruger, I believe, is the...
That's that the smarter you get, the less confident you are in your own knowledge?
Oh, no, that's not what I thought it was. I thought that the Dunning-Kruger one was about how only incompetent people get promoted. Like unconscious incompetence.
No, that's...
Oh.
I think that's I don't know if there's I don't know that I've heard a term for it, but it's people being promoted one step above their maximum level of competency. But I think Dunning-Kruger...
In the field of psychology,
Okay.
the Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias in which people with low ability at a task overestimate their ability.
Yeah.
It is related to the cognitive bias of illusory superiority and comes from the inability of people to recognise their lack of ability. Without the self-awareness of metacognition, people cannot objectively evaluate their competence or incompetence.
Yeah, so the better you are at a thing, the more you realize that there is entirely possible that there's stuff about that thing that you don't know.
Oh, that's totally not what I read that definition
I think I'm doing
to
the
mean.
corollary of it, but
I see,
it's
okay.
like the extension of it is like if you plot it on a chart, the people's confidence as one axis and their abilities or competence as the other axis, the beginning stages is I'm awesome at this because you're just learning this.
Sorry, I'm listening to you and I'm reading the Wikipedia entry, which goes on to say, as described by social psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, the bias results from an internal illusion in people of low ability and from an external misperception in people of high ability. That is, the miscalibration of the incompetent stems from an error about the self, whereas the miscalibration of the highly competent stems from an error about others. Colloquially, people experiencing the bias are said to be on Mount Stupid.
Someone is going to be able to do a supercut of us discussing the Dunning-Kruger and Bader-Meinhof thing because I know we've had this conversation.
Yeah,
This is like
I'm
our
pretty sure
Groundhog Day.
I probably should have just bookmarked this page.
I need it on a sticky note, right beside its feudalism, dummy. Ugh. Anyway.
Good old feudalism.
Speaking of feudalism, mine is sort of I'm kind of doing history, like regular history, which is out of my ballpark. Not that etymology isn't out of my official ballpark, but so maybe would you mind if I jumped into mine?
Go for your life.
So my word that I am looking at the etymology of today is English.
Okay.
Because I thought, huh.
So I'm
Now this
laughing because the title is already brilliant, and I don't know how this keeps happening.
It's really good.
It really does.
So I will say that this is entirely possible that this is something that is either regional in that, you know, people in the UK are like, would be listening to me do this and be like, it'd be like watching like a small child learn how to stack blocks onto each other, you know, like, yes, idiot, of course that's what it is.
Which is adorable and beautiful and good fun to watch.
And maybe it's regional in that it's literally everyone other than me will be looking at me going, yeah, good job. Now the third block. And, you know, but anyway, I realized
I think
I
what
was
you're
like,
describing there, Ryan, is the essential state of being a human being, wherein getting in, like, I know what things I know. I have no idea if I'm supposed to know more or not.
yeah, exactly.
There is a game show in the UK. I don't know if it's made the jump across the pond or even if it's originally a UK show. It's called Pointless. Do you know
No, I don't know
Pointless? And the idea with Pointless, it's sort of like, it's like a take on Family Fortunes, if you like. So the questions that are asked have been asked of 100 people. And the idea is the fewer points that you score, the better. So, like, let's say that the category was Beatles songs.
Okay.
Right? If you ask 100 people to name as many Beatles songs as they can, Hey Jude is probably going to be mentioned by like 80 of those people.
Right, yeah.
Ish. Something like that. Whereas my Beatles knowledge is not that great. Whereas
Within You, Without You is not going to be on that list.
There we go. Right. So maybe no one in the 100 mentions this. It's a correct answer, but no one mentions it. That would be a pointless answer, and it scores you 0 points.
Okay.
So the idea is that when they ask you these questions, you get as few points as you can. And sometimes it's incredibly hard because you look at, and generally it's like they give you 8 questions to choose from in the initial rounds anyway. And there's 8 potential answers. And you have to, first of all, know what the answers to those questions are. But then you also have to determine how well known those answers are.
Right.
As in how many other people will have gotten that answer too. And sometimes it feels pretty much impossible to do that because you're like, I know what I know. How am I supposed to know what other people know too?
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, I feel like I don't care if I'm about to watch you stacking blocks. It will still be an interesting thing to observe.
Well, good. So I think the reason I started thinking about this, because I sort of had gone through, and it was one of those things that I've literally given 0 thought because I assumed that I knew where this would have come from to a certain extent. Like I just sort of...
These are my favourite ones.
I always kind of went, well, it's English because it's the language spoken originally in England, and it's the England-ish language. So the English language, that's how it is. Of course, that's why it is. As I looked into it, I struggled. So I'm already not an etymologist. I am even
Are you about
less
to be
a historian,
not a historian too?
and I'm about to be not a historian out loud and on purpose. So
I think today I'm going to be not a physicist also.
Yeah.
Just because.
Okay, yeah, it's fun. So apologies to both the History of English and the History of England podcasts because I am getting my muddy idiot boots all over your nice carpet. But it's kind of the etymology of this word and how it kind of came about is sort of a tracing of the history of the island of Britannia, because while my assumption was English comes from England, the word England is actually more recent than the word English. It's a younger word. So English did not come from England. And it's one of the things I find cool with this is that it is kind of an interesting experiment in the ideas of exonyms versus endonyms, like the names that groups give to themselves versus the names that other people have applied to them. So, long story short, which doesn't mean I'm not going to make it long again, is that the word traces itself back to the Angles.
Now,
A or an E.
when you said, I think maybe everybody knows this. All I know is that the Angles are etymologically why it's called English.
Oh, okay.
But I don't actually know a great deal about who the Angles were and what they were doing. So I'm also not a historian. So if you're stacking blocks, then at least they're pretty coloured blocks, and I've never seen them before.
Neat. Cool. Yes, so the Angles were a Germanic tribe that lived sort of the southern part of the Jutland Peninsula, basically the peninsula that is Denmark and northern Germany. Mm-hmm. And the general consensus seems to be that they're called that because there's a couple of theories on this, but the one that I've was able to see the most evidence in support of, or the most people agreeing on, was that the area that were living in is sort of resembles the way the bays work and stuff. It resembles a fish hook.
Oh, okay.
And so it's connected with, it's tied together with the sense of angle, as in to like an angler, a fisherman.
Now, this is interesting because when you talked about Jutland, which I've kind of vaguely heard of before, and I'm aware vaguely of where it is, I thought to myself, I wonder if it's called Jutland because it juts out into the sea.
See, I Googled the shit out of it, but it was basically just to find out where it was because I It was one of those things that I heard of, but I didn't actually look into why.
Well,
but it makes sense that
it's fair enough. You can't look at the etymology of everything. You'd be there forever.
That's true. I will have to look into that. Or someone will know, and please do tell us, because that's interesting. So yeah, it's the idea the area looked like a fish hook, and so they were called angles. Now the thing that I kind of go, well, that's neat, and then I go, but wait, is like I know that cartography is old, but it looks like a fishhook implies the ability to look at it on a map, I think. And
ancient cartography is, as far as I'm concerned, magic.
Yeah.
If you were to say to me, okay, Amy, here are the tools that were available to cartographers in the 14th century. Let's just pick that one.
Yeah.
Just because. Off you go and draw me a picture of what this giant landmass looks like from above. I genuinely couldn't even formulate a plan for the first meeting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, and we're talking in this particular case, like, this is like not 14th century, this is like 4th century.
Yeah.
So it's even... Now, obviously, people were navigating and people had the ability to do that. So I may be layering cynicism on cynicism here. So, and it's perfectly possible that they had a map of their region and saw that it looked like a fishhook, and there was that. The other theory that's presented in Edam Online, at least, is that the tribe got its name from just the connection with fishing, in that they ate a lot of fish and fished a lot for their livelihood, and that was their thing. So, yeah, so it's one of those. And basically the Angles are the first bit of Anglo-Saxon, because the Angles...
Oh, sorry. I must interrupt you, just because if you're going to talk about angling, we need to mention how great Bob Mortimer and Paul Whitehouse are.
Also, there's a Christmas special happening, which made me extremely happy. Oh, because I only have 2 episodes left in that series, in series 3, and I'm sad about that.
Yeah, I said this to you, didn't I? We're kind of rationing them out because it's the sort of TV, it's genuinely a public service at this point in time.
Oh, I need it.
I need it.
I cannot binge it, because then I will run out.
Yeah.
I'm like an extremely conscientious heroin addict. I'm fully aware of my dependency on Bob Mortimer and Paul Whitehouse, and I ration accordingly.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So
essential anglers.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Look it up, The World, and watch it, because they're awesome.
Yeah, so great.
So Anglo-Saxon, Angles and the Saxons. The Saxons were from a different part of Germany, and they were another tribe, and they were the ones that really, hit it out of the ballpark with their conquest of the island of Britain.
Good work.
Good work.
You guys are at the top of the leaderboard.
Yeah. So in the sort of 4th and 5th centuries, they came over and, probably quite violently ransacked the place and took over. And the geographic legacy lives on in place names like Wessex and Sussex, from the Saxon colonizers, and a place like East Anglia was a place where a lot of the Angles lived. And so they were that people. Now, what was one of the things that was interesting to me is that apparently the British Celts and the Romans, who, got up early and arrived first, only to be swarmed by the Germans, they applied the name Saxons to the whole group. So they didn't really have a differentiation, which makes sense, right? Because when you're outside of it, you don't see a difference. And the people would have, the languages would have been, I imagine, quite similar sounding to someone who didn't speak them at all. They were from across either sides of a river, so they probably looked the same.
Yeah, it's rather like the incredibly reductive and, I suppose, racist, it's appropriate to say, Eskimo.
Yeah, or Native Americans.
That says, you're far away and we don't really know that much about what you're doing, and we don't really we're not really interested enough to find out. So we're just going to call you all this one word, which is probably fine for us.
Yeah, for us. Yeah.
And meanwhile, the people who live in this enormous area that some white dude has just determined is amorphous are like, wait a minute.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's the idea that precisely when British settlers came to North America, they had no concept that the Iroquois and the Algonquin and the Mohawk and the Cree and the Blackfoot, they were all different cultures and nations and peoples.
Yeah, actual people.
Yeah. So,
maybe don't just genocide them next time, you dicks.
You could also try asking.
I read a post today on Instagram that said that it was off the back of Thanksgiving.
Right.
I had a conversation with someone at work this week where they said, I mean, I'm not American, but I do really like the notion of giving thanks. So I suppose I'm just in Thanksgiving for the gratitude. And I said, I only love it because of the oppression of Indigenous peoples. Because I sort of agree, it's lovely to stop and be thankful for the things that you have and the privileges and benefits in your life. But I feel like there are certain aspects of American Thanksgiving that could do with a bit of a rebranding.
Oh, yeah.
Shall we say. But I saw a post that said that between, sort of in this kind of 1860s onward in the United States, 500 treaties were signed with various nations and tribes, and every single one of them was broken.
Yeah.
Every single one. It's that whole that word you keep using, I do not think it means what you think it means.
They weren't half-assing it, that's for sure. They were gonna. Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway.
It reminds me of the thing about the best way to celebrate, because it's weird to me. It never stops being weird to me that Columbus Day is a holiday in the States. But that idea that the best way to celebrate Columbus Day is just to kick down some random person's door and eat all their food. Because at least then you're being slightly historically accurate about your celebration of Columbus Day. Like, just wander down a random street.
Give them all a horrible disease that they have no resilience against.
Bring a sick relative to lick all their doorknobs, eat all their food, and then leave. With every intention of moving into their house once they're dead. That's the way to celebrate Columbus Day. But
yeah, I mean, and I was just thinking about how, like, is it fair for me as a white British person to pile on American genocide when let's just say that the UK doesn't have particularly clean hands in the great you started it, you did a worse thing kind of states.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, I think that there is a slight difference between saying, like, we don't have a day here where we celebrate and all get a day off to commemorate the fact that the British Raj was responsible for the deaths of millions.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that thing did happen, and Britain and the British government were responsible for that thing, but we don't make little kids dress up in costumes we think might look like costumes that Indian children might have worn in order to get a day off work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, where were we? Oh, the Saxons, right. So, the Celts and the Romans called all the Germanic tribes Saxons. The Anglo-Saxon groups adopted Angles, and it's a bit unclear whether it's an A or an E, as their endonym at sort of roughly the same time. So it's interesting that they kind of just picked to go the other way.
I feel like a slight inbuilt contrariness might be going on here.
Yeah.
And I just want to say I approve.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I'm here for it. This use of Angles as an endonym for this group of Germanic tribes people was first attested in Latin in a papal letter by, I don't know, the Pope. Whoever was Pope in 595 AD.
Signed, the Pope.
The Pope. My holiness. And then a bunch of history happened, and English became the standard name for basically anyone of Anglo-Saxon heritage to differentiate them from the Danish invaders who were the new the new wave of angry people from across the sea coming to kill you all were from Denmark, basically just slightly further north than the original Anglo-Saxons were.
This maybe sounds like a really stupid question, but did the Angles speak the language that became English? I mean, I realise there's probably quite a complicated answer to that question.
Yeah, so English became, at the same time, alongside it becoming the word for this group of people,
yes,
it started to be applied to as an adjective to their customs and their culture and their language as well.
Right.
And so that's when you think, when you hear about, like when Kevin Stroud talks about, well, this is an English word.
Sure.
In the era that he's talking about, it's sort of synonymous with Anglo-Saxon as opposed to something with more French influences and roots, right? Because the next stage, you see how I'm skipping over all the actual history parts here? This is me being a not historian. So
it's like you're providing some shading that suggests that some history may have happened.
Yeah, so a bunch of history happened and the Danish people showed up and then the Anglo-Saxons became English. And then a bunch more history happened and the Norman conquest came about and the Anglo-Norman period.
And the language just got completely scrambled at that point.
Yeah, and that's when you get all the French influence in English as a language.
And when it started to get really cool.
Yeah, but English, there was like an actual legal distinction. You were English if you had specific and identifiable roots in the country basically pre-1066, like before the Norman conquest.
Okay.
You were only English if you were here before the Normans got here, was the idea. And it wasn't until the 14th century that legal distinction was lifted, was removed.
That's crazy.
Right? So, you see the UKIP people come from a long line of people who insist that if you weren't here by a certain time, you're not English. So it's...
Well, what I was just thinking about, I was thinking about how wonderfully brilliant it is that the word English for those exact UKIP, Britishness, England for the English stuff, the word English isn't even English.
No, it's German.
And the English, the people who gave their name to that word, they were German too.
Yeah. And if native Brits had anything to say about it, like actual, like, capital N, the Celts basically had anything to say about it, it would have been, I guess, Sax-ish or Saxonish. I mean, Saxish sounds pretty badass, but here we are with English because contrarianism abounds.
Racism really is stupid, isn't it?
It's so dumb.
It's stupid.
It's just so dumb. And I feel bad because that sort of trivializes it, but sometimes you just have, it just is. It's just so brainless. Anyway.
I mean, yeah, you're right. It's not to take away from the fact that people have terrible experiences and are oppressed because of it. The actual fundamental principles behind what racism is are just fucking stupid.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
Yeah. So dumb. So basically, English just meant of the Angles, and England just meant land of the Angles. Like it was Engle land. And then people just got tired of having to put a pause there and became England.
Those extra syllables can be such a pain.
It just take up time. One could be drinking. And instead of putting a pause between Engle and land, where the L's just they just want to get together and hang out. The other thing that I found kind of cool is another place where the connection between English and angle comes into play, but not the fishing angle like angling. If you've ever you heard of someone playing pool or billiards or snooker or whatever, putting some English on the ball.
I am not aware of this phrase, but that's interesting.
If you have a shot with a lot of English on it, you're basically applying spin to the cue ball. So if you've got a ball the 3 ball, for instance, just to pick one, right beside a pocket, and your shot is directly in, you don't want the cue ball to follow the target ball into the pocket, because that
Sure,
you lose.
so you
That
put some
sucks.
spin on it.
So you put some backspin on it, so that as soon as it hits the other ball, the cue ball will rebound off of it instead of following it into the hole. And that spin you apply to the ball is called English. And it's called English because of the French anglais, A-N-G-L-E accent aigu, and which just means angle, and it refers to the angle of the cue. You have to hold your cue at a much different angle to apply spin on the ball than you would otherwise.
Oh, that's nice. I like that.
Anglais, the pronunciation of this word is identical to anglais, A-N-G-L-A-I-S,
Yeah.
just the French word for English. And so it just became putting English on the ball because it's the French word for angle, but not the German word for angle because of the fishing, but for... Anyway, yeah.
Languages are fun.
So it's just this weird cacophony of intersecting nonsense, and here we are with English. So, yeah.
That's brilliant. A weird cacophony of intersecting nonsense, I think, is a brilliant way to describe the language that we look at each week.
Yeah.
You know, etymology is essentially the study of that weird cacophony. And I hear the phrase English is stupid fairly frequently, given my role as a teacher of English. And it really is. Quite a lot of the time, it's crazy. But that's sort of why I like it.
Yeah.
It must be such a pisser to learn English. And, I know that people will say, oh, well, it's ubiquitous, so there's lots of places to listen to it and lots of context to kind of experience it. And yeah, I get that, but to actually, if you're someone who really wants to get underneath the skin of a language and really master it, it must be so difficult for that to, just, there are no rules. It's like go and play together and try not to break anything too much. Yeah. And at the end, we'll see what's left.
And all the rules that do exist all contradict each other anyway, so.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, it's very funny. The Duolingo German study in the Hanlon household continues.
Okay, yeah.
I say that because that makes it sound like perhaps I'm involved in it in some way, and I'm not. I'm not involved at all.
Right.
But the only way that I'm involved is to... I don't know if you've ever used Duolingo. I wasn't aware of it, but murmur has come to mean in our house 2 things. It either means German, so like I'm going to go and do some German, to which I will respond, murmur, or it can generally be used as like a good for you, well done, murmur.
Oh, nice.
Which is then, of course, intensified by murmur.
Yes.
And occasionally murmur. So yeah. But there's been quite a lot of, oh, for fuck's sake, German kind of chat going on. And in these sort of discussions and outbursts and difficulties, quite often I am questioned about things like grammar and morphology and how English works. And a lot of the time we don't know the answers to those questions because that's just not how you learn a language when you're learning it as a native. Yeah. At least that's been my experience.
No, for sure.
So yeah, we had to have some long, intensive conversations about cases, for example. And the great irony of that is that everything that I know about cases in languages, I learned from studying Latin, not from studying English.
Right.
Because who would bother their backside to study cases in English? We don't use them consistently enough for it actually to be a thing.
Every now and then one of them shows up and be like, hey guys, remember me? And you're like, back to your hole. And then they go away.
Yeah. You're like, oh, dude, no one's even going to buy you a drink. Sit down.
Yeah. Yeah, the native speaker thing, as you well know, was never more apparent than when kids and like teenagers in Korean English ESL classrooms would come and ask a question. Like, I'll never forget the sheer desolate blankness of my brain when like a 13-year-old Korean kid in my class came up to me and asked me what part of speech yes was. And I was just a void. I'm not sure that I even blanked. Like I think I lost like reflexive nervous system capabilities for a brief moment. I was that just divested and devolved and devoid of any sort of semblance of intellectual capability whatsoever. It's like, shut up, it's a word, go back to your seat. And that's like,
yeah, that's a seriously tricky question. I don't think I know the answer to that question. I'm busy looking it up.
And because it was just, if I could find some way, like with the trend towards mindfulness and meditation and stuff becoming much more mainstream over the last sort of 15, 20 years.
Yeah, sure.
Man, if I could find a way to control the blankness of my mind for that at that moment, I would have an island, because I would have acolytes and accolades, and it would just be amazing, because I've never been more utterly serene just by virtue of being completely empty of all thought. It was amazing.
Yeah, that's actually quite a beautiful description of apparently what meditation is supposed to be. I meditate from time to time. I hate it. That's maybe not entirely fair. I kind of do. Yes is an adverb according to the OED.
Oh, okay.
At least yes. Yeah, it's got yes, adverb, noun, and intransitive.
Oh, see, that's just not fair.
It's really not.
It makes me feel better though, because the OED is hedging its bets as well.
Yeah, it seems like the OED is not sure. So that is pretty reasonable. But yeah, I've probably talked about this before, but like I try to meditate because it's an incredibly good thing to do for your body, your mind, your sanity. It's, very, very well documented that meditation is good for people.
Yeah.
But it's also really fucking hard.
Yeah.
And I think that people don't point that out often enough.
Yeah.
A lot of my experience with the stuff too is that the instructions are quite woolly, and I am not a person. I am a person who loves to follow an instruction. If you tell me what to do, and I know how to do that thing, I am the happiest person in the world.
Yeah.
Like, Amy, can you stack these pieces of paper into bundles of 10? I'm like, yes, I can do that. Success is within my grasp. But, like, sit still. Empty your mind. I'm like,
yeah.
Dude, you may as well ask me to fly.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm much more, and I know that's not that's a bit unfair, because there are excellent teachers of meditation and there are excellent schools of meditation where they start at, actually, this is a really hard thing to do, so here are some ways to help you to access the first part of that thing that is generally asked as step 1, when it's actually kind of like step 500 for a lot of people. So yeah. But it is cool, and I think that the sort of benefits that people attest to from a regular meditation practice are like way to go brilliant. But also, I hate corporate mindfulness. Have I talked about this before?
I think so, yeah.
It comes up in my life a lot because I work in a corporate setting, and I'm also a yoga teacher, and I generally refer to it as people fucking up yoga. Because they go, oh, your job's incredibly stressful, and lots of people are like off sick with stress-related illness. Let's give them a yoga class. And you're like, that's lovely, but also not the answer.
Right.
It's like as if, let's say you're my boss, right? Let's say I'm a runner and you're my trainer, and I am going to run a marathon. So you tell me that in order to prepare for the marathon, every day from day 1 until the day of the marathon, I should run 26.2 miles or whatever it is. Now, if I was to do that, by about day 3, I would be broken.
Yeah.
That's not how you train for a marathon. I would be absolutely screwed. So at that point, the equivalent is for you saying, for me to say, I'm exhausted and broken, and I don't think I can take much more of this. Oh, okay. well, look, tomorrow we still need you to run a marathon. Here's a knee support. Like,
surprise.
you know, the deal is not about me needing an extra thing to make all the shitty stuff good. The deal is that the shitty stuff needs to be tackled.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, yes. So I'm glad that you experienced that moment of beautiful clarity, even if it was tinged with the slight existential dread of, holy fuck, I don't know anything about anything. Which is, it's how I feel when people ask me complicated questions about grammar. And I'm quite into grammar. I probably know a bit more than the average bunny, but still, the questions are hard.
Yeah.
Cool. I like it. I like English a lot.
Yeah. So there's English.
So here is why I am laughing at the when you announced which word you were talking about today.
Okay, yep.
The word that I've chosen to talk about today is read.
Nice.
Read English, kids.
It's
good.
It's amazing how that works out sometimes.
Yeah, it really is. I feel like if we were trying to be this synchronistic and organised, we'd fuck it up somehow.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, like we don't want to tamper with this in any way because we'd break it. Read. I don't know why it's taken me so long to get to this word, because I don't know. I think about reading a lot. I do it a lot. I love it. I encourage it in other people. And it seems to me that reading is the single most impressive thing that human beings are able to do. Now, that might sound like a really far-reaching statement. It might sound like a broad, sweeping generalisation. But think about it. I am a person with a brain and with thoughts in those brain that are entirely my own unless I choose to share them with somebody else. If I choose to share them with somebody else, I have a limited number of ways to do that. I can share those thoughts and those ideas by speaking them. I can interpret them in some other way, like with movement or with art or something along those lines. But if I want you to know exactly what I mean, and this is the bit that really, really blows my mind, if I want that to be a permanent record of exactly what I mean, that anybody else can access for the next however long time is, I can write that down. And then, 1,000 years later, somebody else can know exactly what was in my head.
Yeah.
That's magic.
It's pretty crazy.
It's absolute witchcraft. So I genuinely think that reading is one of the most impressive things that human beings can do. Writing, obviously, goes alongside that, but I often come back to thinking about how incredible it is that this system exists of sharing and recording information. It's just fantastic. It's absolutely amazing. So I decided to have a look at the etymology of read. And I discovered something really, really interesting.
Ooh, okay.
I've got some ideas about that really, really interesting thing that I will get to. But first, a quick word about the etymology as given by the OED. The OED talks about the word as being inherited from Germanic, like so many English words. And it's cognate with Old Frisian reda, R-E-D-A, which means to advise, to deliberate, or to help. Middle Dutch raden, to advise, to suggest, to convince, to devise, guess, think, or plot. Old Saxon radan, R-A-D-A-N, to advise, to plan, or to arrange. Now, I think with all of these, the list goes on. There's a range of various Germanic languages that continue to have this very kind of stable sense of advising, deliberating, making a decision, interpreting, explaining. All of these senses are, kind of stay pretty stable. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting because while you can see how reading relates to those things, it's not quite those things.
Yeah, no.
So advising or deliberating, it's not the same as looking at a page of writing and interpreting that. And this is something that's reflected in the meanings, the usages given to the word. So the first definition given by the OED of the word read is to consider, interpret, or discern. So in the way that you might read a face, or read a room, read a situation, that kind of thing. And this is cited first in Old English, in Bede, good old Bede, who we've talked about.
Hooray.
Bede. You can tell that I was pronouncing the spellings differently there, even though it sounds as though they were all identical words. Just, work with me here. and this sense continues and is cited in pretty much every century since then. And the notion that you are looking at something and discerning a set of meanings from that thing. That's the first definition that's given. We then have, now, interestingly, we get a couple of obsolete senses. So to think or suppose that something is the case is an obsolete usage. To guess, make out, or tell by conjecture, this is also an obsolete usage. To take for something, as in the citation given from Spencer in 1591, I saw a stately bed that might for any prince's couch be read.
Oh.
I would assume that it was a prince's couch. Obsolete and rare. And then we get to make out, discover, or expound the meaning or significance of a riddle or a dream or an omen or a set of signs. And all of these have Old English citations given in the OED. So this word has been around for a really, really long time. People have been figuring things out for a long, long time in some sense, some way, some manner. And there's hundreds of usages of this word: to count, to reckon, to see, to discern. And it's not until we get quite far down the page before we get to scan or study writing silently, or especially in early use, by oneself or for one's own benefit. And I really love the fact that this distinction is given, because of course there are different ways to read writing. And I'm sure we've talked before about, in fact, it may have been Bede. Is Bede the person who is thought to have invented reading in your head?
No, St. Augustine.
St. Augustine, that's right. I knew that we'd had this conversation. I think I heard it on QI a long, long time ago. And this sense that you can read, before that, everyone just said out loud the words that were on the page.
Yeah, reading was an oral exercise.
Yeah.
And a public exercise, usually.
Yeah, really, really interesting. So this notion that scanning or studying writing silently has its, gets its own entry in the dictionary, I found really, really
that's very cool.
Interesting. Yeah. And then we get just to interpret or to be able to interpret the written form of a language, to peruse books written in whichever language it is. The sense is given to reading music, so as in to sight read, to go through written work in order to look for quotations, and so on and so forth. It's not a word that we have to look particularly hard to find meanings for. And a lot of the meanings are very, very interrelated. We know what reading is, or at least we think we know what reading is. And that's pretty simple. But here's the interesting thing about it. Etym Online says that all of these redan, redin, arada, ratha, Germanic cognates come from the PIE root re, just re, which means to reason or to count, and in fact gives us the word reason. It says words from this root in most modern Germanic languages still mean to counsel or to advise. It's connected to riddle via the notion of interpreting.
Oh, okay.
Still Etym Online here. Sense of to make out the character of a person is attested from the 1610s, and the transference to understand the meaning of written symbols is unique to Old English, and perhaps under English influence, Old Norse. Most languages use a word rooted in the idea of gather up as their word for read. Now, that struck me as really cool. of all the Indo-European languages, German, French, Albanian, whichever way you want to go,
Yeah.
the words for read don't look like our word for read. So in Albanian, the word for read is lexoj, Lexoj.
Right.
In Italian, it is leggere. In German, it is lesen.
I wish I could make the Duolingo noise right now, but I don't remember what it is, but I was going to make it. It's in my head. I want you to know that. Yes, that's the one. Thank you.
And in Latin, it's legere with a G. Interestingly, this root exists and has influenced words in English, like lexicon and indeed lexitecture. And
Right.
this lex part comes from a PIE root, leg, which, as is stated in the other entry, it means to collect or to gather, with derivatives meaning to speak, as in to pick out words. So to gather things and choose the ones that you need.
Right.
And this gives us all sorts of interesting cognates. Anything that has, lexia, so dyslexia, but also
Right.
words like eclectic and logarithm and logic, loyal, monologue, tautology and trilogy, all have this sense of gathering words together and picking them out.
Right, of course, yeah.
But not in English. In
Yeah.
English, we have this different word. And so re, the PIE root, which means to reason or to count, is given as a variant of the PIE root ar, which means to fit together. This gives us cognates like adorn, aristocracy, armature, armour, disarm, gendarme, and these all have a sense somewhere in their etymology of fitting things together and organising things in a particular way. So from that, this takes us to re, which brings us to count. And what I find most interesting about this is there is that sense there of, it makes me think of counters in a game, Scrabble tiles or sticks, gathering them all together and then sorting them out. So in other languages, in other Indo-European languages, we have the sense of the gathering, but only in English do we have the sense of then sorting them into piles, if you were. And the word, the PIE root re gives us arithmetic. It gives us dread and hatred and logarithm and ratio, reason, rhyme, riddle and ritual.
Wow.
It is the hypothetical source of, this is from Etym Online again, or evidence of its existence is provided by Sanskrit rad, which means to succeed or accomplish, Greek arithmos, meaning number or amount, Latin rere, to consider, confirm or ratify, which gives us rite and ritual, Old Church Slavonic, yay! We heart Old Church Slavonic, raditi, to take thought or attend to, Old Irish imradim, to deliberate or consider, Old English redan, to advise, counsel, persuade and eventually read, Old English and Old High German rim, number, Old Irish rim, number, and also Old Irish dorimu, I count. And all of this makes me wonder, what was it in English that people were reading that caused this shift to happen? Was it the things that people were reading? Was it the way that people were reading?
Yeah.
Is there something that is fundamentally linguistically different about gathering words together in order to read them, like all the other Indo-European languages did, versus counting and reasoning the words the way that English decided to go for?
The numbers
And-
connection is really interesting. Like,
Isn't it? Yeah. You tend to think of these two things as separate. Reading is over there on one side and numbers and counting are over there on the other side.
Yeah.
Not so, not in English. In fact, they're all mixed up together, just like, that crazy accidental confluence of stuff that kind of becomes English. There are, of course, about 1,000 compound usages.
Right.
using English, to read along, read them and weep, to take something as read, to read between the lines. And what I find super duper interesting about that divergence in English as opposed to the other languages is it's almost that ineffable, unanswerable question. When you read a word, is the word that you read the same as the word that I read?
Right.
Like, when I see something that's blue, do you see blue too?
Yeah.
So I started off in a place where reading was something quite incredible to me. And now, as well as having my mind blown by the fact that people can, across time and history and space, record their thoughts, their ideas, their deliberations for me to read thousands of years later, now I've also got to consider whether or not reading is even something that exists. I think I've just existentialized myself into nothingness.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think my favorite kind of whimsical depiction of reading is, and like you say, one of the more magical things that's possible is just the idea that any one of us has the power to instill in someone else's brain a very specific hallucination by scrawling down on a bit of mushed up tree.
Yeah.
And it's like, and you will envision that thing. You know, I can conjure an image in your brain by putting a series of markings down on a piece of paper.
It's just
crazy.
It's just unbelievable. Or I could take a very specific set of instructions for a task. Maybe even it could be a task that you aren't even aware of its existence yet. And within reason, I could give you the instructions to allow you to complete that task without us ever even meeting.
Yeah. Yeah,
I'm incredibly impressed by reading.
I also like we're talking of St. Augustine and being kind of reputed to be the first person to read silently, and that the implications of what reading meant at the time. It made me think of the fact that now the sort of default understanding of reading is, I think, silently, because we have the idea of, if someone just said, oh, he read the book, you have to specify he read the book aloud.
Yeah, it would be quite an unusual... I mean, if someone was sitting on public transport with a book, reading it aloud, people would look at them oddly.
Well, and not only is it the default way to do it, but it's like our default understanding of the word is that it doesn't involve vocalizing, I think.
Yeah.
Like, if you just read the sentence, he read the book, in your head, are you picturing someone reading that silently or aloud?
Yeah, you're picturing them reading it silently.
Silently. And it made me, I mean, this is a tangent, but that's what we do. It made me think of the idea of, it made me think of raisins. And here's why. Because in English, we have these two words for what are the same thing in a slightly different state, right? Like grapes and dried grapes are raisins.
Sure.
And we've got our own words for that. But in French, raisin is grape, and raisin sec, dry grape, is raisins, is what we call raisins in English. But for some reason, it came across here as being its own thing rather than a thing that needed a modifier on it.
Sure.
And why that is in some places, and the same thing with like onions, in some languages, the onion is a green onion, is what we call a green onion in at least North American English. That's the default, and all the other varieties are variants on that.
Types of that thing, yeah.
And so the specific state that becomes the default understanding and doesn't need a variation on it is a really interesting thing for me, and it kind of ties into the book called Invisible Women that I read, and the author is controversial because of because like a lot of authors are controversial because of issues of transphobia and such. But one of the primary things is just trying to point out, and I've seen it done in other places too, is trying to point out that the default assumption so often in society is that the thing is being done by men, and women's sports needs the modifier.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Soccer or football is obviously men's football, whereas women's football, it's hockey and women's hockey.
Yeah.
As
You
opposed,
don't have to say men's hockey.
Exactly. And I mean, now to the credit of people who are trying to make those changes, there are, at the Olympics, I've seen it more and more with broadcasts and stuff being identified, men's ice hockey and women's ice hockey, like they are making those distinctions, which is good. But it's all these examples of how you look at what words don't need modifiers and what modifiers need to be there to think of how things have changed and what that reflects on about the society. And so reading has gone from, holy crap, that dude is literally a wizard because he's reading a book just inside his head silently, and nobody's ever done that before, and I don't know if we should burn him or worship him, or I don't know what to do with this guy because he's, to now, whereas we need to tell people specifically if it's reading out loud because reading is inherently silent and internal.
It's like the Fosbury Flop.
Yeah.
And yeah, I hadn't really thought about this in that particular context, but you're right. And I wonder too, I mean, Dick Fosbury caused a splash. He made a stir, and the whole should we burn him or hail him as a prophet thing was absolutely, is he even allowed to do that?
I wonder if this is a thing where I happen to know what you're talking about, but we should maybe explain what it is we're talking about. Oh,
sure. Yeah, so prior to Dick Fosbury, every competitor in the high jump they ran at the pole, facing towards the pole, and they took a standing jump, not a standing jump, they lifted their legs up as high as they could to try and get their legs over the pole. Do you think that's a reasonable way to describe that?
Yeah.
And so Fosbury developed the technique of running out from the side in an arc and putting the torso over the bar first.
Yeah. And
of course, the method that he used not only smashed the record, but revolutionized the sport to the extent that I think they were going to disqualify him. Like I say, that the notion of, is he allowed to do that? And I think that what's interesting is that in etymology, we don't necessarily always have a figurehead like that. Like, who decides? Decisions aren't really... Now, I know, as soon as I say this, I know that there are exceptions. Obviously, I won't be able to think of any exceptions right now. But it's rare for somebody to be saying, oh, actually, the first person to use that particular sense of that word that we now accept as the only sense of that word was such and such a person at such and such a time, and the reactions to that usage were blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, right,
because
exactly.
Actually languages don't really do that. They just they ebb and they flow and they move around and they get used casually, and people pay attention to rules or they don't pay attention to rules. And
they're too gloopy to have really identifiable points of change, usually.
Yeah. Anyway, reading.
Love that. Yeah. Read English.
Read English.
And that's it for another episode of Lexitecture. To get in touch with us about something you heard in this episode, you can email us at words@lexitecture.com. You can also follow along and talk to us at Lexitecture on Facebook and Twitter, and at Lexitecture Podcast on Instagram. For back episodes and the occasional blog post, visit us at lexitecture.com. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you again soon.